Hello and welcome to the Beyond 6 Seconds podcast. I'm your host, Carolyn Keel, and on today's episode, I'm speaking with Sarah Brown. Sarah's a New York City-based podcast producer and editor. She's worked on shows such as Minority Korner, Get On Up, #Matter, and Fixing the Future. She also produces her own show called The Queerience, which is a show all about the LGBTQIA plus community. Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so excited to have you here. We will be talking probably a little later about your podcasting work and all of the great endeavors that you do there. But you're also here to talk about your own story around your own neurodivergence
Yes.
and where that comes from. So I understand that you learned at some point in your life that you have Fragile X syndrome.
Yes.
For those who aren't familiar, what is Fragile X?
Well, it's like a genetic mutation that it's funny because most things or disorders or whatever, they mainly affect women, as we know, or anybody with birth giving parts. But this one affects men worse. So in women, it's a little more milder. I have a more milder case. I'm going to read the true definition. So it's basically a genetic disorder that's caused by changes in a gene called Fragile X messenger. I'm going to pronounce this wrong, ribonucleal protein. And basically how my mom would explain it to me when I was younger and I didn't understand what was going on. It's sort of like your X chromosomes are broken in a way. So I have it and my brother has it, but it manifests in him as more severe, as terms of intellectually and being able to function.
I was doing some reading on Fragile X syndrome and just learning so much about it. And I do remember that it can manifest in many different ways. For some people, it manifests as intellectual disability or other types of disabilities or just characteristics. So how does it manifest for you?
It manifests for me as ADHD, especially the hyperactive part. When I was younger, a lot of my teachers would be she's too disruptive. She's distracting others in class. And that was because of the ADHD. So that's how it is for me, at least.
How did you find out that you had Fragile X syndrome? I don't know if it's something that you routinely test for, or did ADHD come first, or how did that work?
Yeah. Well, no, you're right. It's definitely not something that was routinely tested for in the 90s when, but my mom has been working in disability services my whole life. And when I think once my brother was maybe 2 or 3, we started to notice something was different, and he got tested, and that kind of prompted me to get tested. So by the time I was 6, I was taking medications and stuff like that. And I just remember being in a room, being asked to build blocks and look at a computer screen with a blinking light. And we later figured out that I believe my grandpa had a milder form of it and passed it on to my mom. And my mom didn't know she was a carrier of it. So she passed it on to me and my brother, and my sister is a carrier of it. So that's kind of how we found out. Yeah, just through my brother having it and us getting tested. I think maybe nowadays people test a little more for things like that. But in it was 1995 when I was 6 years old, and they were really testing. Not a lot of people really did that. I feel it wasn't really well known as much as it is now. People were even using the word neurodivergent.
Oh,
people had never even heard of that word. Yeah. So a lot has changed. Yeah. But that's how I found out, I guess, in a nutshell.
Wow. As I was reading up on it, I read on a website, and you can let me know if this is accurate, but
Yeah.
I think Fragile X is one of the few clear genetic ties that can manifest as different kinds of neurodiversity. as we say, most neurodiversity, there isn't like particularly one gene that causes, say, autism or ADHD or dyslexia or
Yeah,
anything like
yeah.
that. But Fragile X, it seems like, as you said, can manifest differently in different people. And I guess one of those manifestations could be ADHD, like it is for
Yeah.
you. Yeah, that's really interesting. That was something I didn't know about at all until I read that.
Oh, yeah. So basically, like, when I have kids, if I like give birth to kids, it's like I think it's as you have more kids, like the percentage goes down depending on like what you have or like what their genetic makeup is that have it too, and you pass it on to your kids.
Okay.
So there's a whole like testing thing for that. But yeah, it definitely manifests itself differently in everybody. And yeah, I don't really know a lot of people with it actually. I only know like me and my brother. So I'm still kind of like making my way through the community, I guess.
You mentioned that it manifests mainly for you as ADHD, but I guess what was it
Yeah.
like growing up with Fragile X? Like, did you have other manifestations of it aside from ADHD?
I mean, definitely fidgeting. I mean, right now I'm playing with my slime
Mhm.
just so it's like a focus thing. I feel like that's really relatable on this podcast. So
Oh
I
yeah,
don't know.
yeah.
Yeah. A lot of this is interesting, but like it manifests it for me, we notice in my joints. I have very like loose connective tissue in my joints, which is weird. So growing up, like I would always walk inward. And yeah, growing up with it though, like not a lot of people really knew what was going on. So it was sort of like I was completely dependent on my mom. I remember, in elementary school having to go to the nurse's office around like lunchtime, maybe to like take Ritalin and being like 6 years old, not really understanding how to like swallow a pill or like what this medicine was going to do. Yeah, and not really understanding like why I couldn't really like look people in the eye or focus at all or understand why like I was so bad at math or whatever. But I don't really think I identified with it a lot. Like I kind of just felt like I was a normal person. I had friends. I had like so as much as someone can have a social life in elementary school. But yeah, it wasn't, I didn't really like talk about it a lot with my friends because it just like never came up. Nobody was like, why are you so weird? Because I think maybe all my other friends were weird too. So it was like, yeah. But yeah, growing up, I had what's called an occupational therapist
Mhm.
who would work with me in elementary school. And we would like do certain things, and she would kind of even just like teach me how to hold a pencil correctly and get like good grips and stuff, things like that. So it was a very like interesting thing, just understanding that like I was a little different and I was like going to be learning a little differently than others
Yeah.
as I got older. And like obviously, school would get harder. I would be in like the resource rooms, or they called it special education at the time, but they do
Yep.
not do that anymore because that would be problematic. But yeah, like all through high school and stuff. And yeah, I think it took me a while to like come to really grips with it and understand that like, oh, like you're different because of this, like because of this and this, like you're learning differently than other people, but also like not being around a ton of people who are also like that. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? I feel like back then not everybody was getting diagnosed with ADD or ADHD. Like people didn't really know what it was.
Hmm.
I remember even in like just a few years ago, one of my roommates was like, that's fake. Like that's not real. And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? I think, yeah, that's kind of what it was like. Just, you know, trying to navigate that. But, I think I was very privileged in that my mom knows so much about it and
Mhm.
had studied it and understood it, that I kind of had her to sort of guide me and like help me in certain ways.
Mhm. Yeah, it's true. I guess it's really only been pretty recently that people have been talking more openly about their neurodivergence and kind of finding
Mhm.
their communities. Because with the internet and especially with social media, where you can much more easily find people in any part of the world who share parts of your experience. It's really pretty amazing.
Oh, yeah. And
Yeah.
finding the right community for you, like on Discord.
Yes. Yes. We met on Discord of
We
all
met on
places. And that's
Discord.
something that I'm pretty new to, but there's
Same.
there's a really cool podcasting community on Discord that is really great for sharing information and meeting a lot of great people. So I guess after school, like, did you know what kind of work you wanted to do?
Because of like the ADHD, I always wanted to like run around all the time.
Mhm.
And I wanted to like have a big personality and be like crazy. So I got into theater of
Oh.
all things. So
Mhm.
I was a theater kid. Yes. And then like the pandemic happened and a bunch of other stuff happened. And I started, and I had already had a podcast before,
Mhm.
but I decided to just kind of like make it a career. One of my friends, James Arthur M., who created Minority Korner podcast, he's amazing. He got me my first like podcast editing job.
Mm.
And from there, I was like, oh, I should do this as a career. Like, this is something I should be doing. So now that's what I do.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I've done some editing on my own podcast, and it's really something I think people either like really love it or would really outsource it to somebody else. You love it or you quote unquote hate it. So it takes me such a long time. So it is really valuable to have someone who specializes in editing and putting all that together.
Oh, yeah. And I think it's especially good for people who are maybe neurodivergent. And I think it helps me because I have ADHD that I can almost just like hyper focus a little bit and just be like, oh, this is what needs to get done. Cause it's like, it's a visual and audio at the same time. So that's, I think, why I really like it. And I'm also able to not do other things, but it's such like it doesn't feel tedious. I guess that's probably why I like it so much.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about the hyper focus because I know when I'm editing, it's, hours go by and it's like, I don't think I even got up from this chair in like a couple hours. And it's like, yeah, you get absorbed in it. And if you like it, it's really fun and rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if the content is good and you're interested in it.
Yeah. Now you're also a podcast host. You're the host of the Queerience podcast. Are you currently
Mhm.
the host of that?
Yes, I
Cool.
am. We talk to people in the LGBTQIA plus community. I've talked to, let's see, reverends, doctors, advocates, activists, especially right now, our community is under attack, especially the trans community. And we're always trying to shine a spotlight on people to more educate people and to
Mm.
help people understand what's going on and who we really are. And because this is a neurodivergent podcast, a very, very big percentage of trans and non-binary folks are neurodivergent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's been a ton of like studies about it, but that is something that gets talked about is like the correlation between neurodivergency in the community.
Yeah, I've heard that and I've seen that as well. So what kind of do you have people on to like share their stories or do you talk
Mhm.
current events?
Yeah, I bring them on to share their stories. Like I had someone from the Queer Detainee Empowerment Project, where they help queer people who are detained in other countries for being queer. I talked to some doctors from the Queer Health podcast about, accessibility to healthcare for the queer community and how much it's changed and what access people have now and how we can give people more access. And I've talked to a reverend who was helping bring over trans people from El Salvador who were seeking asylum.
Wow.
So I think that kind of all has to do with like current events,
Sure.
so I really just like to hear people's stories and hear like what they have to say and what they're doing within our local community to try and like, help people make the world a better place, educate people, stuff like that.
That's really powerful, especially bringing
Mhm.
those stories from all different parts of the world.
Exactly.
It's
Oh
very,
yeah. It's very, very powerful. And yeah, it's very interesting. And it's an education for me too. I've learned a lot. And, being in this community, you're constantly learning and you constantly need to educate yourself. Even being in the neurodivergent community, I didn't really know about that word for a while until very recently. And I just started using it. I'm still even learning about what my ADHD has manifested itself as, and even my Fragile X like today. I'm still learning what that means for me.
mhm. There's so much to learn. And yeah, I'm always learning.
Yeah, the more we're learning about it and the more we can educate ourselves and help others, that makes it just like better. Like mental health is finally at like the forefront of a lot of the conversations that we're having, which is so important,
Yeah.
especially for like the youths, the
Oh, yeah.
little babies,
Oh, yeah.
who like are growing up in this crazy, crazy,
Yeah.
insane, the world is collapsing around us time. We'll look back on this and be like, remember?
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's a really wild time. So very important to focus on mental health, especially now.
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you're still learning about your own, manifestations of what Fragile X
Mhm.
looks like for you, what ADHD looks like for you. Do you feel like that's changed across your life in terms of how you experience it from like when you were a child versus now as an adult?
Oh, yeah, I think when I was a kid, I really didn't, like, care at all. I was just like, "Okay, bye. I'm gonna go, like, eat worms or something," like, you know what I mean? Oh my gosh, if my mom listens to this, she's gonna be like, "Why are you saying that on a podcast?" Um, but now I think that, like, I'm older, I've kind of grown up a little bit, I've really taken the time to come into my own and focus on myself and see, like, how I can improve. Maybe I shouldn't use that word improve, but how I can live with my ADHD instead of trying to, like, get rid of it or look at something as, like, it's something that needs to be cured or
Mm,
something that's, like, wrong with me. I think when we stop thinking about it like that, it's easier to deal with. It's easier to sort of cope with. Like, the other day, I knew, like, if I didn't do my laundry right away when I got home, I wouldn't do it. And I
mhm,
was like, because of that, like, I have to do it right now. Like, I have to go grocery shopping right now or it will not get done. Or, like, the fact that we have, like, a chore chart in my apartment because, like, all of us, me and my 2 roommates, we all have ADHD, and, like, if we don't see it, if we don't write it down, like, it won't get done. And little things like that that I've come to learn about myself. Like, if I'm remembering it now, I need to do it now. Otherwise, I'll forget about it.
mm,
Like, having a routine is really important, like, little things, just, like, making my bed every day and, like, knowing what I'm gonna wear the next day and stuff like that really helps. Yeah, just little things like that, like, just going through the process of, like, growing up and, like, learning that I have to do certain things to
mhm.
make my life easier about, like, living with this. So, yeah, and even, like, buying slime so I can, like, have this little, like, thing to play with in my hands while I'm talking on a podcast, so I'm not, like, trailing off or whatever. Just little stuff like that, that I've had to learn for myself, but I've had a lot of help. I'm not on this journey alone, but yeah, I mean, the fact that I'm able to be independent, make my own money, like, live on my own, little things like that are just, like, really important to me that I know some people with Fragile X are unable to do, or with ADHD are just unable to do. And there's nothing wrong with that, we're all on this space rock together flying, and we all have to do it our own way. But I know for me, like, certain things, like, if I don't do my dishes, like, right after I eat, I won't just, like, little things like that, that I've come to, like, learn about myself through all of this.
The point of learning about yourself and knowing what works for you, and probably in some ways trial and error, just to understand, okay, this helps me get through the day and this helps me do what I need to do. And yeah, I think everybody has to learn that for themselves. And sometimes, sometimes it takes a while. It's a bit of a discovery.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It is. And especially like, in this world that we're living in, when so many more people are vocal about being neurodivergent. And it just feels so good to know that. You know what I mean? Because we didn't really have that growing up. Not everybody was vocal about it. If you had ADD or ADHD, you were a troublemaker. It wasn't like, oh, you need help. It was like, oh, you should be put in detention or something. You know what I mean? I see it changing, but I also see where a lot still needs to be learned by others to better understand people.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, a lot of the people I talk to on this podcast talk about growing up and even going through parts of their adulthood really feeling like they were the only person who did this or thought that way, or like we're sort of the only one of their kind. And it's just so interesting to see people connecting and finding wider communities of people, certainly for, the neurodivergent community, even the ADHD community, and hopefully also for the Fragile X community. Yeah.
Well, after my freshman year of college, I was on like academic probation. So my mom sent me to this school called Landmark College. It's like a school for people with learning disabilities, or I shouldn't say they're like people who are neurodivergent. So like there I kind of found a community with other people who had ADHD and like who had it worse than me, who like I felt, I was like, oh my goodness, like there's other people like this. And it was probably one of the first times I was like solely around people who were sort of similar to me. And I was like, oh my God, like it was almost too much. It was almost like, it was like, wow, this is crazy. Like, this is insane. But yeah, totally. Like you grow up kind of feeling like you're the only one, especially with something like Fragile X that like literally no one, there's still people who have literally no idea what it is.
Oh yeah.
People like are still learning about it, finding out new things about it. Like it's still, I guess, kind of like a new thing. I don't know, but you kind of grow up thinking like no one really gets it because it's not really talked about. It's definitely like an interesting thing to be on here like talking about it and being like, yeah, when you're sharing your story about having this, it sort of feels like a lot of people are kind of going through the same thing.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. Like a lot of people who may have shared like the same experiences who are like around my age, like, once again, like being a product of our childhood in the 90s. Not a lot of people like knew about it, but yeah.
Well, that's really cool. And it's great that you're sharing your story about it, because then, the more that we hear people talking about their experiences with different, whether it's neurodiversity or disability or, any other kind of conditions or experiences, then it can help us really feel like, we're not the only ones.
Oh yeah, of course. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, now there are definitely a lot of people with ADHD.
Oh yeah.
I don't really hear a lot about, I guess, ADD and ADHD. They're different.
I think they changed the diagnostic criteria now, so it's still very confusing even after they changed it, but I think that's what happened. It's hard to keep up. Yeah. So I think it's great that you're sharing your story, and I appreciate you coming on my show and talking about your experiences.
Thanks for having me. This was fun. This was nice.
It was fun. So how can people get in touch with you if they want to like listen to your shows?
Let's see. Well, on Instagram and Twitter, it's the Queerience podcast, and you can listen to it on anywhere you listen to podcasts. It's on Spotify, Google Play, all the usual suspects. And I'm on the Discord podcast groups. You can also find me there, where we're all just chilling.
Cool. I'll put some links to your podcast and your socials so people can connect if they want. Sarah, thank you so much for being on the show. As we close out, is there anything else that you'd like our listeners to know?
I think I would leave it with advice of just like be able to accept help and know that it's okay. It's okay to be different, everybody. It's okay to be yourself, and being yourself and loving yourself is a journey, and that's okay. Like I said before, we're all just on a flying space rock thing going through the universe. So, ask for help, be yourself.
That's great
Yeah.
advice. Yeah, asking for
Yeah.
help, definitely
Mhm.
important. And of course, we all need to be
Yeah.
ourselves and share our
Yeah.
stories. Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. It was great talking with you today.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. This was great.